Our trainer today. Eileen M. Russo, MA, is a licensed addiction counselor, a certified clinical supervisor, and a certified co-occurring disorders professional who has worked in the addiction and mental health field for the past 34 years. Ms. Russo is a professor and program coordinator for the Drug and Alcohol Recovery Counselor Program with Gateway Community College. In addition to teaching and training, she specializes in treating co-occurring PTSD in mental health and substance abuse populations, and has assisted agencies with developing trauma-informed mental health and substance abuse treatment programs for men, women, and children across Connecticut. Ms. Russo has co-authored articles on the integration of trauma-specific services into substance use treatment, and is co-author of the curriculum Healing Trauma, A Brief Intervention for Women, 2nd edition by Stephanie Covington. She was the principal consultant from 2007 to 2016 for the implementation of Healing Trauma Beyond Violence and Helping Women Recover in York Correctional Institute. I am now pleased to turn it over to our trainer today, Eileen.
So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for attending today. And here we are a year out, a little over a year out from a global pandemic, and actually dual pandemics, which I'll talk about. At least dual pandemics, I'll talk about a little bit later. I think at this point you've attended the original training with me, or perhaps watched the video where I reviewed understanding trauma. There was also a training that I did on vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. I know you attended a training with Alicia Davis on self-care, and I know that there's been many others. So this particular training is to talk about what is it that we're seeing a year after, what's going on with the people that you provide services to. I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening with you. And I'd like this training to be more of a conversation and less of me preaching to the choir, so to speak. So I'd like to begin with having you either unmute yourself or please put in the chat, what have you noticed in the people that you are providing services to? So over the year, now here we are, April, what is it that you're noticing in the people that you're providing services to? So this is the question, what have you noticed in those that you are providing services to?
One of the things that I have noticed that have changed regarding to my clients is their needs and priorities. Like before, it was more about they needed food and cash assistance and that kind of stuff. And now they are more into getting more emotional support and stress management and that kind of things.
Thank you, Anna. I hear from a lot of treatment programs and people that are doing, that are therapists working in private practice, and, some treatment programs say they have 3 times the amount of clients now that they had a year ago. People in private practice, there's, they're full. So some are more anxious, some are more at ease, anxiety, mixed feelings. Some people are moving but still live in fear, hope but guarded, uncertainty and stress, grateful for the services, hesitant about the vaccine. Yeah, and it doesn't help that today the United States announced that they're going to pause using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. A little relief. More people are open to the idea of counseling. Yeah, so we have a lot of common themes here in terms of still some level of anxiety and fear on one hand, but then on the other hand, some hope, some gratitude. Yeah, somebody wrote, gratitude for having an active listener. Absolutely. I mean, if the pandemic has shown us anything, it has shown us as helpers really how little control we have. And certainly we connect people to services and those kinds of things, but we really can't change this global situation. So, for years, I've always told beginning counselors that don't be surprised when clients say to you, thank you, you've helped me so much. And your response is, I didn't do anything. Well, sure you did. You were the active listener. And can be, having somebody listen can be hard to come by. Yeah, a lot of anxiety about being homeless, grateful to the coach program. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And as we go through this morning, if you would like to unmute yourself, ask a question, share something, add something in the chat, I really like that. I'm not the kind of person, never have been the kind of person where I'm comfortable just lecturing, just giving information. I really do like the give and take. I have no idea how the video person ends up editing so that they just get me. I know one time I was doing an in-person training and they were trying to record me, and the video person just gave up and went home because I'm all over the room. There's a lot of interaction. I try to be spontaneous. So let's see what we can do with this information, as we move through the morning. I'm going to share with you what I thought the purpose of today would be, but I'd also like you to add into the chat, what is it, any questions that you've had that have been bubbling up recently, anything you hope to get out of today's workshop. So what I was thinking of in terms of today is that to review the response to prolonged trauma, because this has been a prolonged situation, and discuss and define the impact of collective trauma, how we are experiencing this together to greater or lesser degrees. And then, identify what is it that we could do, what is it that we could continue to do. So if there's anything that you would like to see discussed today, anything that you have questions about, again, please add it to the chat or just unmute yourself. So I thought I would begin by just reviewing some definitions. And not everybody may have heard the same definitions when I talked about them in whenever it was, January or February. Sometimes we forget definitions. So I just thought I would talk about a couple of things. So one definition is that when we are trauma informed, that we need to have a broad definition of what it means to experience trauma. And this comes from the work of Dr. Kenneth Hardy. And I think that one of the resources I sent out, or maybe was part of my PowerPoint the last time, was actually a talk that Dr. Hardy gave a few years ago in Boston. But he has been talking about this probably most of his career, and I first heard him back in 2003. And what he says about trauma is that it devastates one's being and at the same time overwhelms, destroys, or neutralizes coping. So when we're talking about traumatic experience and devastation to the person, it means then that that devastation is defined by the person, that it's not up to us to say, oh, that must have been very traumatic, or that must have been very difficult, or that must have been very upsetting. That we're really asking the person, how has this impacted you? And then the other piece to this is that overwhelms, destroys, or neutralizes coping. And just as a reminder, he doesn't say anything about people develop maladaptive coping mechanisms, they make poor choices. He doesn't say anything about that. That this really is about, and then we can go to Dr. Herman's quote, which is, this really is about that given enough trauma, anyone would experience difficulties as a result. I just read an article yesterday where the definition of resilience was a psychological trait, which gives the impression then that if you have it and you're resilient, you're a great person. And if you don't have it and you have some trouble, and then you're a weak person, that there's something wrong with you that can't manage traumatic experiences. So one of the things that I always say when we're, on the road to being trauma informed is that we want to eliminate in finding new ways to blame the victim, and instead think about what Dr. Hardy says, is that really trauma is devastating to the person, and it can overwhelm, destroy, or neutralize coping. And that could be temporarily, it could be long-term, but it's really not about the person not being able to manage. It is, as Dr. Herman said, the nature of trauma itself. So in the chat, when we started out, there was comments about, people feeling, still some anxiety and fear and hesitation and, those kinds of things. We would expect for people to have those responses to traumatic situations. And certainly we would expect to have people to have those responses over the past year. And my guess is that everybody in this room today has had some level of those same responses, at least on and off throughout the past year. So to continue on with the definitions, that when we're trauma informed, we move to the question, what happened to you, right? So we're moving away from the question, what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you? And when an agency is trauma informed, it means that the whole agency, the culture of the agency reflects that. But for us as individuals, we're moving away from that question, what's wrong with you, to what happened to you? And if we're trauma informed and culturally responsive, we're asking this question, what happened to you and your people, and what is still happening right now? And as a result, if we are so once we become trauma informed, it's not enough to just know something, then we want to do something. And so being trauma responsive means that services change or we change. When we're culturally responsive, it means services change or we change, right? That we do things a little differently. And then trauma-specific services are those kinds of services, generally considered clinical services that directly address impacts of traumatic experience. So things like beyond trauma, seeking safety, EMDR, accelerated resolution therapy, trauma recovery and empowerment, right? So those kinds of things. And the reason why I mention that is because I often hear people say, oh yeah, we're trauma informed, we offer seeking safety groups here. Well, you can offer a trauma specific service such as seeking safety, but it doesn't mean that your agency is trauma informed. Being trauma informed means that, and trauma responsive means that our general practices are seen through the lens of trauma, from how we answer the phone to how we do an intake and an admission, how we provide supportive services, how we do care coordination, case management, right? All of those kinds of things. So that's just a refresher of some of the definitions that I always ask people to keep in mind as we're going through understanding trauma. What do we generally expect to see? So I'm not going to go over everything that I went over before, but acute reactions, meaning that, the expected reactions that we see when there's some close to the event, right? When something first happens. So they're considered acute reactions. They usually last 4 to 6 weeks. And if they don't, then we're starting to look at post-traumatic stress disorder if it goes longer than that. So expected reactions. What do we expect? Well, we expect people to be anxious. People have a hard time sleeping. In fact, I think lack of sleep during the last year is probably the most common, one of the most common problems that I have heard. I don't know about you. And certainly my sleeping patterns have changed. So anxiety, difficulty sleeping, feels really jumpy, startles easily. Being irritable, not being able to concentrate, and many, many other reactions. So some of the things that were in the chat this morning, fear, right? Those are the kinds of things that we would generally expect. And these are things that people are still experiencing off and on, even though it's a year later. We've been living with this. We've been figuring out how to live with this. We still see a lot of these kinds of reactions. And it's because living in this pandemic world, it's not one event. It's not like one and done, right? So we had this experience. There was a beginning, there was a middle, and there's an end to it. There isn't an end to this. There certainly was a beginning, and there isn't an end. There isn't a predicted end at this point. They do make predictions, and then something changes, and that creates more anxiety and more fear. But we would expect to see these kinds of reactions. And all of this we put together with, we have not lived through this before. We haven't, the country has, but we personally hasn't. But I don't see anybody that looks like they're over 100 years old at this point. Unless somebody is who doesn't have their camera on, right? So it means that, and even if you are 100 years old, you were a child through the 1918 flu pandemic, right? So we haven't lived through this before. We don't necessarily have a frame of reference. There was some. There was a comment in the chat that children are feeling these symptoms as well. Yeah, absolutely. There's a high degree of anxiety, unrest, not being able to sleep, fear, all of that. And then on the flip, somebody's also saying too much sleeping. Yeah, so that can be part of, what happens in terms of a response to trauma. So, the pandemic, we haven't lived through this before. I mean, I know people say it, but we really haven't lived through this before. So when I was putting together today, I'm thinking, well, what is it really that I could want? We haven't lived through this, so I can't tell you what to expect tomorrow and 2 weeks from now. Like, we can't figure it out. None of us can really predict on how people are going to behave, how we personally going to respond, what services look like. It looks like we're inching towards a return to normal. Some people are saying, well, this is the new normal. And I've never liked that term. I don't know about you. I don't like that term, the new normal. I don't even know what that means really, except that everybody's using it. But here's something that I heard 2 days ago that I really like. The new weirdness. That's what I like. I'm like, yeah, okay. Like, even though I've been wearing a mask for a year, it still doesn't feel normal to me. So I don't want to call it the new normal, but it's like the new weirdness is what somebody said. And I got a little chuckle out of that, but I thought, that's a much better job. A much better word than, the new normal. Somebody is saying, yeah, they love that. Yeah, I like it. When somebody made a comment, the community is also unaware of what to expect on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, absolutely. So 2 days ago, Communities, we're talking about bringing in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine into vulnerable communities, people that are homeless, college students, so they didn't have to worry about people coming back for a second shot. And now here we are a couple days later, there's a pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So now what? So now what would be the next step? And what does that mean? So yeah, so as individuals, we're not sure what's going to happen day to day. As a neighborhood, as a community, we're unsure. As a nation, we're unsure. As a world, we're unsure. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And often people are saying, well, if it's anything like the flu pandemic, then we're going to go through another 1920s. And I thought, well, I would like that. I kind of like the clothes from the 20s. Like I wouldn't mind that. But I don't know if that's really what they meant. So we haven't lived through this before. So in terms of what is it that we tell our clients? What is it that we do next? How is it that, I can do a training on this? We haven't lived through this before. But I can say this, that there has been this sense of traumatic loss and traumatic grief, sometimes called complicated grief. Which I have a slide on that. And, and this is caused by death and loss that was unexpected. Now, in terms of traumatic grief, in looking this up, looking at the DSM-5, doing some research on this, traumatic grief was really connected to, singular events, really. So, for example, the parent who has lost a child to death, I mean, that's unexpected. There's no frame of reference to that. We, as parents, the assumption is that our children are going to be burying us, right? That we're not going to bury our children. That's really what the term traumatic grief, something like that, was really more connected to. Death or loss related to, to violence, certainly, traumatic event. And by no frame of reference, I mean just that this isn't the usual course of events in somebody's life. So there isn't a lot of frame of reference, and that there can be, lack of closure. So even though most of the literature out there is really talking about like one event, when I think about the losses that people have experienced over the last year, to me, it really does fall under the category of traumatic grief, that we have not had time to say goodbye to people, to put closure on that. We haven't had, like the usual rituals, that help us say goodbye or help us manage things. And we just haven't had access to that. So we have this experience collectively of this traumatic grief. And there's something else I want to say about this in a couple of minutes. But we've had this collective, on some level, this collective experience of what it means to be living in a pandemic and to have things in our lives change so dramatically. And then in terms of this, so we have this traumatic grief, and then complicated grief. So what the traumatic grief or the traumatic losses, and then complicated grief, right? So there's intense sorrow and pain, not able to focus on anything else, a persistent longing. So when you think about these in terms of a pandemic, there was really a lot of depression over everything that people have lost, in terms of, kids not being able to graduate, and you know, cancellation of weddings, not being able to have funerals, loss of jobs, loss of home, not having enough food, kids not going to school, you know, like just that intense sorrow over what it is that has been lost. And, you know, this intense longing for, you know, whatever the previous life was. And, you know, and a problem's accepting death and feeling numb, which this numbness, even though I still see a lot of anxiety, I also see this numbness, and numbness and detachment. Like people just can't take anymore. So it's not even that they're checked out, but they're just completely numb. Like they can't, really have a hard time responding.
Eileen, can I say something?
Yes. Yeah.
So when we're serving people, especially in the the Latinx and African American communities, look at look at the picture. We have violence, police officer violence against men of color. That's in our face. We have children at the borders. That's in our face. We have workplace violence in our face and natural disasters. And I think for a lot of the people who are in vulnerable communities, they're trying to understand. You expect us, and I'm just figuratively thinking,
Right.
You expect us to accept this vaccination and all of this going around us, and who's paying attention to us? So how can we trust the government? That's not really, we don't feel doing something for our communities to take this vaccination, which now is put on a hold. And so people really, for our role is trying to educate them to build the trust factor, but for them to see the world as it is right now, it's just a message. Some folks find it difficult to separate. And so I find in those encounters that we have, depending on the person that we encounter, is, you know, saying to them, yep, I'm impacted by the same news that you're hearing. And it's constantly teaching a message of trust in individual decisions, because collectively it doesn't look good. You know, it just doesn't look good. And so we have to constantly peel back layers so that people can understand the message.
Yeah.
And that's the struggle. That's the fight against the war against itself. You know, the government is issuing the vaccination. People are receiving assistance from the government, but at the same time, it seems like a non-movement of what about these issues? We have pandemic, we have mental health, substance abuse, we have gun violence, workplace violence, we have children at the border who all can eventually be impacted by the virus. And so that's the difficult message that I find, that those conversations that we have amongst each other's colleagues, but also too, it's in our face. How do you constantly have a population who won't take the vaccine because of hesitancy? And then this is what they're being presented to from the other side. I said a lot, but I wanted to say that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sylvia. I do have a slide on that, you know, a few slides up, but yeah, this is, you know, I'm sitting here, and so far I've really mostly talked about, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is just one more layer on all these other things, right? The systemic racism, the violence, poverty, you know, anything related to oppression, and really what I think about, you know, terrorism, although that term is typically not used unless we're talking about another country. But yes, it's layer upon layer upon layer of things. And this is just the latest layer. These other layers have been there for hundreds of years. And now it seems, well, we thought it came to a head a year ago, but it never seems to really come to a head, meaning it comes to a head, and then we can we can move forward and do something with it. You know, you know, again, on the news, you know, another Black man is shot, you know, there's violence towards that lieutenant in the Army, you know, the way he was pulled over, how he was treated, all of that. I mean, you know, and it goes on and on and on, as you said, Sylvia. So, yeah, you know, somebody's writing, you know, the community has no faith in taking the shot, yeah, and Johnson & Johnson was being pushed in the, you know, in the comment is in the minority community, right? So yeah, and now we have today, you know, they're pausing it because of the blood clots problems. Yeah, so it just it doesn't seem to be any end to this, that there is layer upon layer upon layer. So when we're talking about traumatic grief and complicated grief, all of those things are a part of it. It's not just a one event. It's not just a one singular thing. And that, you know, the comment is that it's even hard for many people to even talk about, you know, taking the shot, so getting vaccinated. Yes, thank you. Are there other comments? Anybody else that wants to add to this discussion? And so to, you know, to all of these, there's no easy answers, and there doesn't even seem to be any answers often. You know, that you know, that we're talking about things that have been going on for so long, and it seems like people are starting to talk about things, but nothing has really changed yet. So this, you know, and I ended that or began that conversation with, you know, feeling numb and feeling detached, and, you know, you feel like you can't take on one more thing. And this extreme bitterness, which is certainly, you know, it makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't people be bitter? Feeling like life has no meaning or purpose, not being able to trust other people, and not being able to, you know, to enjoy life. So, you know, I think we're seeing all of these things, even though with complicated grief, really, you know, generally the conversation is, well, it's just related to one thing, but it's much more complicated than that. So I see we have a couple of yeah. So, you know, the question to everyone here is, you know, how do we try to convince the community to deal with their trauma? I have a little bit of a response to that, but I want to throw it out to everybody. Like, how would we, like, how do we invite a community to deal with trauma or to talk about it? How do we do that? I know that the department, that DEMIS has hosted quarterly courageous conversations in different communities.
One of the things that I was thinking about, and the coaches participated in a training that Daryl McGraw had done related to, you know, trusted messengers, and just really the incredible importance of having people from communities have speakers come in who are representative of their communities, and to really kind of appreciate the culture of who you're talking to, not only, you know, somebody who is Latinx or, you know, maybe even male, female, LGBTQ. I mean, very specific issues that may come up in different communities, and being able to kind of share a sense of kind of togetherness. And, you know, I talked to the coaches last week. There's a bit of a movement in in a trusted messenger campaign that the coaches are going to be participating in, but it just kind of reinforces time and again the importance, like we are kind of all the same, but we are different as well in terms of like who we are, where we come from, culture, gender, identification, all of that really do make a difference, I think, when we're dealing with extreme stress. So I don't know what your thoughts are, but or what the other coaches are thinking, but kind of just seems to be resonating.
Yes, it does. And I like what Daryl said about trusted messengers. So somebody else, let's see.
Hello, yeah. Good morning, Eileen. It's Germano.
Hi, Germano. How are you?
Good morning, everyone. I don't know. I just have a lot of thoughts, and just to speak directly to your question about, how do we help the community, address their traumas or look at their traumas, and then, so often, we just live in this microwave society, and we're looking for instant cures, these silver bullets, and I just think back to some of the populations that I work with. In particular, men that have been homeless, substance abuse population, incarcerated, and so like in doing assessments on these individuals, they didn't even recognize trauma, so, if the question is, have you ever, experienced trauma, came up, and, 75% of them said no. Right. Then as I began to break down examples, you ever been in a car accident? You ever been, in a bad fight and got cut or shot? And like, oh yeah. So one guy, he was like, he had got shot in the head and didn't connect that with trauma. Right. And so being able to take a person through the process to get them to even recognize, that they have had trauma, right? They may, been traumatized, and like they may not have, the situations may not have overwhelmed their ability to cope. But I think that, the way that it has chipped away and affected them, and simultaneously, as a coach, we often have our own personal traumas that we have not dealt with or recognized. And then we're being exposed to vicarious trauma. We're interviewing and dealing with people that are constantly talking about being sick, having near-death experiences, people dying, so it's like sickness, disease, and death. We're surrounding it. We're kind of like walking through this, being in the Ministry of Health. I often reflect on the scripture says, although I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, and so like, there's a certain amount of protection around me, but at the same time, am I ignoring the amount of trauma that I may be absorbing, and not acknowledging. And so like at the same time, denying my own experience, and then, being there to help others, becomes, kind of twofold. And if at least minimally twofold, but a lot of the calls that I've been fielding lately, and in fact, I got one this morning, prior to this training, because I had sent out a bunch of surveys. So we're doing surveys now. And so one of the persons that called me back, and they said, well, what disaster are you talking about? Are we talking about COVID? And so even looking at COVID as a disaster or pandemic, sometimes people are just not making the connection with language, to begin with. But then, they had been told me they had called out of work, and every time they get sick or they get a symptom, they think they're getting COVID all over again. And so that preoccupation, one of the questions on our assessment is, is there preoccupation with death? And it may not necessarily be preoccupation with death, but it's preoccupation with, getting sick all over again. And these are people that have had really bad symptoms, and felt like, they were near death. And so that could be traumatizing over time. And like, I just kind of, wonder and worry about people that have, been hospitalized or, really had some of the symptoms that, we've heard reported, the shortness of breath and the chills and those sorts of things. And, and how they even get past it, you know. And so just kind of the solution is, you know, it has to be, you know, in through a process, right? I don't think that, you know, a yoga, meditation, or breathing exercise may offer, you know, some relief for a moment, but long term, you know, like you said, we haven't seen this before, not in our lifetime. And so the solutions, I think, you know, are multi-layered. And so I don't know, I feel like I'm talking too much now, but I just wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Germano. Yeah, no, you're not talking too much. Everything that you said, I think, is really important and really speaks to how multi-layered this is, and really also how relevant the idea of, you know, complicated grief and really complicated anxiety that goes along with what we're experiencing. And, you know, the original question was, you know, how do we convince a community? And, you know, how do we talk to a community? And there was, you know, my response was going to be, well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that it exists. We, you know, each individual has to acknowledge that this actually exists in the world. And what I mean by that, or in our country, what I mean by that, there's still a lot of people that are saying, oh, you know, COVID is a hoax, or racism doesn't really exist. People are just being too sensitive, or, you know, that, well, yeah, sure. It used to be that people who are LGBTQ would be threatened and persecuted, but in 2021 we're much more open. So if we can't even validate what it is that's happening, if we can't talk and validate, then we're really not going to convince anybody else much of anything. So many people in the chat wrote, well, we need to listen and validate. We need to listen and validate. We need to listen and validate. And absolutely, we need to listen and validate. And other people are put in the chat, you know, making sure that they know that we're here for the long haul, that our agency is still going to be here. You know, having small groups, right, at a time are good. Even if it takes a little longer, it can be very effective, you know, being present. But I also want to come back to something that Germano said, which is, a lot of people say, oh yeah, you know, so the example he gave, yeah, I was shot in the head, but I never thought that was traumatic. I hear this a lot too. Well, this is just how I grew up. This is just what my life is every day. This is just what I'm used to. And so then if I say to people, so is it okay with you then if your children have the same experiences that you have, right? That have the same, oh no, I want something different for my children. I don't want them to live how I lived. So sometimes that is a way in, is to say, well, so what is it about how you, well, you know, there was too much violence, you know, there's, you know, I was harmed as a result of my skin color and ethnicity and religion, and I don't want that for my child. So sometimes that is a way in to having that discussion. I may have shared the last during the last training that there was an agency that one of their clients was murdered, and I went out just to talk to the staff and be supportive, do some debriefing, and pretty much they all said the same thing. Oh, well, we're used to it around here. This is just the neighborhood where we are. But then when I started to say, well, you know, tell me about this person, you know, that you all had in treatment for so long and that you got to know, tell me about this person. And once they started to talk about the person, then they were able to get in touch with, yeah, you know what, this is not normal. You know, that this, what I feel about this is not normal, that this is really impacting me. So I think too, putting, having people talk about, how things impact them personally is also another way in. And then, and then the other response is to continue to work in whatever way that we can to change, the policies and practices that drive racism and oppression and sexism and homophobia, right? So changing those systems. Yeah, which actually was just in the chat, right? That reminding us that we need that systemic and organizational change in our society, which seems, seems still so far away. So, so thank you. Yeah, and somebody put in here, people who are homeless are worried about, are more worried about being in a shelter than taking the shot, and that they feel that this is their trauma, right? So, having to make the decision about which is more scary, right? Being in a shelter or, getting vaccinated, and so being in that situation. Still being more worried about the shelter. Great. And this is really what we just talked about, and what I had called like the tsunami of grief, right? That there's multiple impacts, multiple deaths and illnesses and loss of employment, loss of home or threat of losing home, loss of connection, right? So this tsunami of grief, which is why now we're seeing more of that anxiety, people being more open to counseling. And then other long-term effects is, right, really having a hard time calming down or regulating themselves, right? Which is why we still see the impact on sleep and, why we still see, anger and irritability. There's an impact on relationships. For some people, being together for so long has been helpful. For others, it's not been helpful. But the impact, on relationships, there's also an increase in, domestic violence, and exhaustion from being isolated and restricted, right? So there's some exhaustion that's been going along with all of this, that numbness, that fatigue, this emotion, feeling emotionally drained. And, I had said that we haven't lived through this before. And then I found this article that was published in 2008. And the article was, what could we expect? Actually, let me get the correct title. So, mental health considerations during a pandemic flu outbreak. So this was back in 2008. And what the authors did was they took a look back to the 1918 pandemic and wrote this article and really called for intense training of mental health and medical professionals on what could we really see as a result of a pandemic. So this is what they said. So this is 2008, right? So this is 12, 13 years ago. So based on what we know from the 1918 pandemic, the long-term effects are an increase in anxiety and mood disorders. So a lot of you have said that. An increase in acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think we're seeing some of that now. Loss of confidence in major institutions, right? So not having trust in medical institutions, governmental institutions, right? So some of the things that Sylvia had mentioned. Threats of additional waves, so what they called waves and what we've been calling surges, right? That increases vulnerability and anxiety. So what Jumano had said with, when people, people start to have symptoms or they're not feeling well and they think, that they've been reinfected, but also just collectively, there's always been these reports of, well, now we're in the, the second surge, the third surge. Can we avoid a fourth surge, right? That there's this really this increase in anxiety and vulnerability. And I also think too that when there's this threats of additional, like an additional surge, there is this increase in vulnerability and anxiety, but the flip of that also is, I hear a lot of people say, well, then it doesn't really matter what we do. That the masks don't matter, the social distancing doesn't matter. Like, people just get tired. If this is still going to be happening, then why am I bothering with all of this? And then something that I had said earlier, that recovery is not possible until there's a defined endpoint. So we can't say that we're in recovery, we're moving, maybe we could say we're moving towards that, but it's really not possible until there's a defined endpoint. And so with the 1918 pandemic, there was actually an announcement that said that today is the day that we declare, meaning the government declares, that the pandemic is over. There was actually a date. Also, not SARS, but there was another threatened pandemic. I forget when, 80s, 90s, same kind of thing, that there was a defined beginning and an end date. So we do have a defined beginning date at this point, but we don't have a defined end point. So, this also impacts people's, mental and mental health and medical health. So any comments on that? That they wrote this, so many years ago, well, not all that long ago, but 2008, that they were making these predictions on what would happen if there was a flu pandemic. And when I read this article, I was really taken aback a little bit, that actually we knew all of this, that we actually could predict what would be happening to people over this past year. So any comments or questions on that?
Eileen, it's Kim.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I still have a hard time wrapping my head around is just this whole idea of like animal to human transmission, and just this whole science behind that, and how just as kind of an average citizen, you kind of need to be, informed by the science, but in a way that makes sense. And it's just a result again of just all the destruction in our society. Again, this is another one of those bigger societal issues that happen when people are kind of invading the space of animals, and just the whole global situation. So I don't know if that's making sense, but just the whole idea behind how this has happened is also kind of really strange in some ways,
Yeah, and there was something on, I don't know if it was 60 Minutes or something a few weeks ago, and I thought, oh, okay, so they're going to come up with some answers, but they don't really have any answers. They think this is how it happened, but they're not sure. And if you listen to Jane Goodall, she would say, well, as long as there's poverty, there's going to be a market for the wet markets where these animals are sold. So she has a different view on it that I don't know if that really connected with me either, but you're right. It doesn't, it is hard because it doesn't quite fit. It doesn't, at least, I agree with you. It doesn't make sense to me either. And then if they if this is true and they know this, then what do we do about it? Yeah, I don't know. It's that's a tough one, but it adds to that level of uncertainty, anxiety, and the mistrust of, towards the people that are giving this this information. So yeah, not an easy, I wish I had an easy answer and said, oh yeah, I made sense of this. This is the answer, but I don't have the answer. Yeah, and another comment, the government and CDC knew that a pandemic would occur. Yeah, they did know, and actually there was a plan. There has been a plan for several years on how to manage a pandemic. There was a I don't think they called it a guidebook, but there was a plan, and there actually was a committee, and the majority of that committee was eliminated in 2016.
Yes.
And then the existing plan also was not followed. Yeah. And, that's what makes this. So there's another comment, I too have not been able to make sense of this. This is what makes it traumatic. If we could make sense of this and say, oh, this is how it happened, this is what we could do, we're going to be consistent with it, there's a beginning and an end, we probably wouldn't be sitting here talking about trauma. We'd be perhaps talking about something else. I mean, not that there wouldn't be any anxiety or anything like that, but that's the nature of trauma, that it's based in fear. People don't have any control over it. It's unexpected. And the trauma, a lot of the aspects of this trauma that we're experiencing come from people in power who did things like ignore the plan, eliminate the committee that was in charge of managing a pandemic, all those kinds of things. So we have all of those components of traumatic experience that is feeding into this. Yeah, certainly, the unknown. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what trauma is about. It's based on fear. It's based on the unknown. It's based on that no matter what we do, we cannot control this. We couldn't prevent it. We personally could not prevent this from happening. And now we can only do what we think is best in terms of how we protect ourselves and how we protect our families. But yeah, there is all of this unknown, and that's what continually feeds the trauma. Yeah, so poor leadership. Yeah, at the time of the outbreak, that there's been enough experts out there that said if we had followed the original pandemic plan, that we would be in a different situation. Okay, so this is something I said that I wanted to circle back to a little bit, in some of the comments that Sylvia had made, Germano has made, other people have made in the chat, and it's this, because I've heard this a lot. Whoops. That we are in the same storm, right? We're in the same storm. It's true. We're all experiencing the same pandemic, but we're not in the same boat, right? I mean, there's a difference between experiencing this from a yacht or a cruise ship and, a rowboat that looks like it's not really going to take us too far. So, in talking about some of these things that we have been talking about, I am aware of my privilege, that I speak from a place of privilege, that I can talk about systemic racism, but I have a different world experience, or I'm a white woman. I'm pretty sure that when I get in my car today, I'm not going to be arrested and murdered for driving while white, right? So I know I come from that place of privilege. Same thing. If I don't feel well, right, I do think, just like everybody thinks, oh no, is this COVID? But I also have health insurance, and I can call my doctor, and I have a computer, and I can do a telehealth session. So that's what this means. And maybe you have all heard it before, but I tend to hear this. We're all in the same storm, right? We're all in the same, well, typically I hear we're all in the same boat. We're not. And then somebody had mentioned this, that, oh, we're in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And so, part of that response to an individual or a community is to really recognize and validate that we're not in the same boat. And I want to advocate for everybody to have the same boat, right? To have the same privilege. I certainly want to, Dr. Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, said, let's focus on policies, right, to bring about change. So I can certainly do what I can to change policies, be careful who I vote for, and, all of those kinds of things, and advocate in my town, in my place of employment, and all of that, so that, I can advocate for everybody to have the same boat. But right now, that's not the case. And so I think, based on everything that's been said in the chat, that you all already know this, right? That a key role for all of you is to listen and to validate what people are experiencing. And so, because we're not all in the same boat, this impacts community resources and response. And I don't know if everybody saw it, but somebody had put in the chat that, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was brought into minority communities because the assumption was, well, the people aren't going to come back for the second shot, so we're just going to bring in the one and done. So that was a community resource and response to the community. But now look what happened. There's this, there was distrust to begin with, and now there's really going to be distrust as a result of the pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But in terms of what communities have for resources and how they respond, every particular community is different. But I also think there's always been a lot of expectation. I was going to use the word burden, but a lot of expectation that that communities do take care of themselves, and that churches turn into food and vaccinations centers, and that, oh yeah, they'll take care of themselves, they'll figure it out. So I think there's always been that expectation, but all of this does impact resources and response. And then this gets layered on the chronic stressors that we've already talked about, poverty, violence. In an earlier slide I had, oh no, that's coming up. So poverty, violence, food deserts, right? Not being able to, to access food, healthy food, being, the only place available is, maybe going to a bodega. And then medical deserts, right? So not having enough medical care, enough doctors. So I think about that and what people really have access to. And by medical deserts, I include not just what we typically think of in terms of medical care, but also access to mental health care, treatment for a substance use disorder, and how do people access the services that they need. And access the services that they need in a non-judgmental, welcoming way. Are they welcomed into services? So distrust. So in the chat, distrust comes from past experiences. Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah, just historically, a few things that have been done to people, by people in charge, governments, you know, and even not too long ago, and by not too long ago, I think like 5 years ago, there was, you know, and it may have even been Minnesota, but don't repeat that in case I'm spreading a rumor. But there was a state in the United States that offered money to women with substance use disorders that were considered high utilizers, or sometimes derogatively known as frequent flyers, offered money to those women to become sterilized so that they couldn't have children. This was this was not too long ago. So there may not be big things going on that are making the news, but there are some things that have been going on still. Yeah. Yep. Okay. And still distress from the fact that people are dying. So, you know, so this impacts communities, individuals. And, you know, I want to come back to this slide in a minute, but I just want to add to this what we've been talking about, like these concurrent pandemics, you know, certainly racism, systemic racism, and then an increase in hate crimes, you know, and Asian Americans. So there was a report that came out last week that hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased by 150%. People who are trans, and particularly the murder of Black women, Black trans women, and anti-Semitism. So an increase in hate crimes towards people who are Jewish. So we have, you know, all of these things, you know, a concurrent pandemic of hatred and race crimes and systemic racism. So they're, you know, often called a dual pandemic. But I separate this out, right? So concurrent pandemics, because I think we have more than two going on. But I wanted to mention, so, you know, what is it that is triggering people a year later? And certainly we have talked a lot about some of the things, right? So things that I had come up with, like anniversary points, you know, so a year ago I was doing this and now I'm doing that. So I think that can be, you know, that can be triggering. Those conversations sometimes can be triggering, or they're just reminders. And that, you know, there's inconsistencies in terms of, you know, credibility and unfairness. So we've talked about that. Exhaustion and disillusionment, media, and then whatever the personal triggers are. Media, if I had one recommendation for anyone, and this is tough because there's so much going on, that it would be to limit your exposure to media, not eliminate it, but just limit it. If you miss something, you know they're going to recap it at some point. And this is tough, especially with the Chauvin murder trial. But, you know, if you could limit yourself, and there's a lot of people, and I'm not saying anybody in this room, but there's certainly a lot of people that will say, I'm glued to the TV, I'm glued to this, I'm glued to, you know, I can't get away from this. And it doesn't give us a break. You know, if we're doing this all day at work and then we're listening to the news, you know, all night, our bodies and our brains, they don't get a break. We don't get an opportunity to regroup a little bit. But media, you know, my attention's often caught by, you know, a headline, a soundbite, you know, something like that. And then I read the whole article and it's like, well, that's nothing like what the headline is saying. Like the headlines are geared to scare people, right? And to hook us in, you know, get our anxiety going. But then when you read the whole thing, it's like, oh, well, no, that's not what it's saying at all. So, you know, some people have been able to go on a media diet, and not even being connected to social media, not watching news and all of that kind of thing. I haven't been able to do that. And but I do limit myself. Oh, okay. So yeah, so North Carolina has a program that's still paying women with substance use disorders to get sterilized. Okay, so maybe that was, I don't know. I thought there was another program, but yeah, or to get on long-term birth control. Yeah.
So everything we're hearing this morning is a lot to swallow, and it's what we do. We hear this all the time. We're being educated about the information. The topic is tough. And we realize that we can't save the entire world. You know, and it's hard. It's hard to hear media. It's hard to hear conversations, the myths that are just not scientifically true. And so what I try to focus on, especially in our group, is we're in the faith-based community, is speak to people in small pods, small groups. It may take longer to get the larger message out, but it's small steps in making small changes so that people can digest what they have right now. And in being able to know that these things exist, because in our community where I've been, I had the Moderna vaccine. A lot of my friends had the Moderna vaccine. That was the first thing that came out. Johnson & Johnson's came out a little later. So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles of taking on the whole war. You know what I'm saying? It's just those little battles as we engage people. It's a lot, you know, your personal life, as Germano stated, your community, every community is different. We know racism is across the board. So to be effective, or to be more effective in this work, I'm in the moment. I have to stay in the moment in our day-to-day activities, stay in the moment when we're encountering people. No one interview, no one person, regardless if you're Caucasian, white, Latinx, or Black, it's all different. It may seem similar, but they're all different. I can never try to impose some of this information or teach people this. That's it. Some things are universals. The package stores stayed open in the Black community as well as the white community. None of them closed, but people do have issues. So I just really try to take people day to day, because the reality is some people are on social media, some people are on TV, they see the same things. And it is life where people tend to believe a lie before they can believe the truth. Yeah. So I just think in small steps, as we have people in our encounters, 10, 5, if you can teach those small people and give them and let them become their own advocates, give them the tools, give them the information, because taking on all of this can be just so much overwhelming, because most of it is true. Racism is true. It's a difficult topic to talk about, but it's true. The bottom line is, if you were riding down the street, like you said, and you got off work and I was in that same path, more than likely I would be stopped. But at the same time, we're all professionals. We have different attributes and different goals that we have in life. And people underestimate, even poor people, how ordinary people can become extraordinary people. And so we just have to embrace our groups as they are and not be able to be Superman, Superwoman. That's not our assignment. Our assignment is to educate, to encounter people who we have encounters with, even though we know the ugly truth and we don't want to hide anything. But I think it's easier than to just like, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. What can I do? What can I do? And so just those small encounters, they really help.
Yeah. I agree with you. And thank you for really showing your optimism and belief and hope in people. I think it's an important message for all of this, for all of us. And you're right. We've been talking about some heavy stuff this morning, and certainly the past year, but, you know, certainly this morning. And I do something similar to you, which is, you know, what can I do right now, today, in this moment, you know, with what I have? And you're right. We don't want to bombard people. And in terms of the, you know, social media, the news, and all of that, I was really inviting us to just take a look at ourselves as caregivers and, you know, make sure that we're able to replenish. We give ourselves an opportunity to replenish ourselves in some way. So let me. So somebody put in, yeah, never underestimate the power of, yeah, of one person. Yeah, absolutely. Which is why we all do what we do, because we believe that we can make a difference. And I do believe that you do make a difference, that we all make a difference, and it can be small. You know, and most often it is small, but it is, but it's still powerful. So we can use the mustard seed analogy. So let's see if we can end with some of that hope that that Sylvia has. You know, so what is it that we can do? Well, really what you can do, what we can all do, are the things that we've been doing, which is, you know, maintain psychological first aid, which is validation, giving people hope, giving people practical and assistance, like, you know, food, clothing, shelter, those kinds of things. So, you know, continuing to do that, and really recognizing in other people and yourself that what people, you know, the responses now might be different than a year ago, and might be even a little harder to recognize. And, you know, as people get used to living in the, you know, in this chronically stressful environment, people do seem to think that, oh, well, this is just how it is. This is just the new normal. But remember, it really is the new weirdness. And people may not know that they're really experiencing trauma or prolonged stress. And continue to apply the basic values of trauma-informed care. So helping people be safe, proving yourself to be trustworthy, which I saw in the chat, a lot of you were saying, you know, listen and validate, showing that you care, being there, all of that. That's how you earn the trust from the person or the community that you're working with. You know, to the extent that you can, we offer choices and we collaborate with people, that we're not going anywhere to dictate and say, this is what you must do, this is how you do it. And then, you know, empower people to live their own lives. So, you know, we're not forcing people to do things, we're empowering people to make their own decisions. And then use any and all of the basic skills for effective trauma response, which includes psychological first aid, which we just talked about, giving information, so that's psychoeducation, giving information. Sylvia's point is well taken, in small doses, right? Small pieces, as people want to hear the information. Doing some basic breathing and grounding skills with people. I think it was Germano who had mentioned, you know, breathing and meditation and yoga. In fact, I want to close today doing a grounding exercise with you. And then safety planning, helping people be as safe as they can in their environments. So I know that all of you do, you know, most of these things, if not all of them. So these are things that we can do, and that are important pieces. Okay, so I do want to, we have like 5 minutes. I want to do a breathing exercise with you, because I don't want people to leave with all this heaviness. I want to give you a few minutes to let go of the heaviness. You can always pick it up at the end of 5 minutes. So let's do that together. So if you're comfortable, close your eyes. If you prefer, just lower your eyes. If you would like to shut off your camera so that you can close your eyes and feel safe, whatever it is that you would like to do to help yourself be safe and comfortable. And we're going to do one of my favorites, which is palms up, palms down. And so I'll invite you to close or lower your eyes. And as you settle in, breathe in through your nose if you can. And exhale slowly and gently through your mouth. And again, inhale. And this time, deepen your inhale. Expand your stomach. And exhale. Pull your stomach in. Release all the air. Soften your shoulders. And one more time, inhale. And exhale. And soften. And I'd like you to put your palms up in front of you. And in your palms, I'd like you to place anything that feels heavy to you. We've been talking about some difficult things, trauma and COVID and racism and hate crimes. Place anything in your palms that feels heavy. And if you have any personal situations that you would like to put in the palms of your hands, something you're struggling with or worried about, add those problems as well. And now I'd like you to take a deep breath. Inhale. And as you exhale, turn your palms over and let all that heaviness go. Just release. And then come back, take a breath. And put your palms up again. And this time, place into the palms of your hands everything you would like to keep. So think about the gratitude of your clients and add that gratitude. Think about the times and add to your palms all the ways you've made a difference to other people. Add to your palms the people that you love and the people who love you. Add to your palms the people that you trust. And when you're ready, inhale. And this time, bring your palms together and put them over your heart. These are all of the things you're going to keep close to you. You're going to allow all that positive energy of love and trust and gratitude just enter your heart and soul. And take a breath. And before you open your eyes or raise your eyes, just move your hands, cross your arms, just give yourself a little hug. And when you're ready, come back into the room. So thank you everyone for participating in that.